A blizzard howls across the Colorado mountains, and through the storm, a ragged woman staggers to a lonely cabin, whispering, "I'm not clean anymore." The mountain man inside draws his rifle. Then his heart stops when he pulls the cloth covering her and goes pale. The blood isn't hers. Something far darker lies buried in the snow outside. As the wind pounds the door, soldiers hunt for her, calling her a killer, branded by a powerful mine baron whose reach stretches from the fort to the church steps. But this man has seen enough of guilt to know the difference between sin and survival. Together they'll fight a winter of fear, a world of lies, and the ghosts that haunt them both. In the frozen silence, trust is fragile, faith is tested, and love might be the only fire left burning. But when the law closes in and the past comes to claim them, what will he do when protecting her means risking his soul? And can mercy still shine when the whole world says she's unclean? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The storm had clawed at the mountain all afternoon. By nightfall, it sounded like 1,000 wolves crying through the spruce trees. Carlos Red leaned into the wind, his coat stiff with frost, his beard crusted white. He carried 2 rabbits in one hand and an old flint lantern in the other. Snow swirled so thick it swallowed the trail, but he knew every ridge and rock by heart. He had built this cabin with his own hands, logs fitted tight, chinked with mud and moss, a single window of frost-fogged glass that glowed faintly when the fire inside caught the draft. When he reached the clearing, his breath stopped short. The cabin door was open. Wind howled through the gap, carrying snow into the dark. Carlos set down the lantern, drew his pistol, and stepped slow, every sense on edge. Out here, miles from Fair Creek, no one came without a reason. He pushed the door wider. "Who's there?" A shape stirred near the hearth, a bundle of quilts, trembling. Then a voice, faint and cracked, broke through the wind. "Don't touch me. Please, I'm not clean anymore." Carlos froze. A woman's face appeared in the firelight, pale, chapped, rimmed in fear. Her lips were split. Her eyes were wide and fever-bright. The quilt around her was soaked dark, and beneath it, something glistened red. He lowered the pistol, slipped off his gloves. "Easy now," he said quietly. "You're safe here. I won't hurt you." She tried to pull the blanket tighter. "You can't help. I done wrong." Carlos knelt near the fire. "Wrong or not, you'll freeze if you stay like that." He poured water from his kettle into a tin cup and handed it over. Her fingers shook so bad she nearly dropped it. "What's your name?" he asked. Her lips trembled. Aubrey Loring." He nodded. "All right, Miss Loring. My name's Carlos Red. You're in my cabin up on Black Timber Ridge. You can rest here till the storm breaks." She didn't answer. The fire snapped, throwing shadows up the log walls. Carlos studied the stain on her blanket. It wasn't a wound. It was too wide, too heavy. And the smell, iron and smoke, didn't come from a cut. He set another log on the fire, then reached for the edge of the quilt. "I'm just going to check your injuries," he said. "Need to see if you're bleeding bad." "No," she whispered, shrinking away. "Don't look, you'll see." Carlos's voice softened. "Ma'am, I've tended worse. Let me help." She closed her eyes. After a long moment, she gave a single nod. He lifted the corner of the cloth and went pale. The blood was not hers. It was dry, streaked across her dress, soaked into the cloth she'd wrapped around herself. Beneath it, her skin was bruised but unbroken. He found no wound, only a mark where she'd gripped a pistol so long it had burned her palm. Carlos sat back on his heels. "This ain't your blood," he said. She opened her eyes, tears leaking down her cracked cheeks. No, it's his. Whose? The man I shot. Her voice was barely more than a breath. He tried to take me. On the stage road, I grabbed his gun and fired. Then I ran till my legs quit. Thought I'd die in the snow. The wind screamed outside, shaking the door on its hinges. Carlos reached up and latched it tight. He understood now, the fear, the shame in her words. She believed herself unclean for surviving. He moved slowly, keeping his tone steady. You did what you had to. Ain't no sin in fighting for your life. She stared at the floor. You don't know what they'll say, that I killed a man. Then let him talk. You're alive. That's what matters tonight. He rose, fetched a clean blanket from his bunk, and handed it to her. Get out of those wet clothes before you freeze. I'll turn around. Aubrey hesitated, then nodded. When she finished, he gave her a bowl of hot stew and set the rabbits aside for later. Her hands still shook, but she ate, spoon scraping gentle against the tin. Carlos rolled out his bedroll near the door. He would keep watch. You sleep. Storm will pass by morning, he said. She glanced at him, eyes full of questions, then at the revolver hanging on the wall. You trust me? After what I told you? Carlos poked at the fire, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Trust comes in pieces. Tonight, I reckon we start with one. Outside, the wind roared like a wild beast. Inside, only the pop of firewood and the slow rhythm of breathing filled the cabin. Carlos stared into the flames, memories rising unbidden, blood on a saloon floor, a man's lifeless eyes, the guilt that had driven him into these hills. He understood her more than she could guess. Hours passed. The storm eased. Aubrey slept curled by the hearth, her hair damp from melted snow, her face soft now, no longer carved in fear. Carlos stood quietly, laid another log on the fire, and whispered a prayer he hadn't said in years. Lord, give peace to those who can't find it. By dawn, the snow had drifted waist-high against the door. Carlos boiled coffee and stepped outside long enough to fetch his shovel. The cold bit through his coat. Near the trail, something half-buried caught his eye, a dark shape under a pine. He trudged closer and froze. It was a man's body, stiff and snow-covered, one arm bent at an odd angle. A revolver lay beside him. Carlos brushed the snow from the man's face and saw the truth. Young, well-fed, wearing a fine wool coat with silver buttons. Whoever he wasn't a drifter. Carlos sighed, heavy as the wind. He dragged the body to a flat spot near the edge of the clearing. With the snow shovel, he dug until earth showed dark beneath the crust. By mid-morning, he had laid the man to rest and marked the grave with 2 crossed willow sticks. When he returned, Aubrey sat upright, clutching her quilt. Where were you? Burying what was left of your trouble, he said. Best no one else finds him. Her face went still. You buried him? Yes. The mountain'll keep its peace. You should too. She looked away, shoulders trembling. You should have told the law. Carlos poured hot coffee into a tin cup. The law don't come up this far till spring, and if they did, they'd see a woman alive and a man dead and make their own story out of it. You're safer quiet. She nodded slowly, though her hands gripped the blanket tight. I didn't mean for it to happen. He crouched by the hearth. I know. They ate in silence. The fire crackled, steady and warm. After breakfast, Carlos pulled a ragged Bible from a shelf. He hadn't opened it in years, but the words came back to him now. Mercy, forgiveness, renewal. You read the good book? He asked. Aubrey gave a faint smile. Used to. Back when I thought I was worth saving. He met her gaze. You still are. For the first time since he'd found her, she didn't look away. The day passed slow but steady. Carlos patched the roof leak above the stove and chopped extra firewood. Aubrey washed what clothes she could in melted snow, hanging them by the fire to dry. She hummed now and then, soft and tuneless, as if trying to remember the melody of peace. That evening, Carlos skinned the rabbits. As he worked, he told her about trapping, how the lines ran through spruce gullies, how a man could read a trail the way other folks read words. Aubrey listened, stirring stew in the pot. I never met a man who lived so far from town, she said quietly. Town and me don't get along, he replied. Why? He wiped his hands on a rag. Let's just say I made my peace better up here than down there. She studied him a moment, as if weighing whether to ask more, then let it rest. After supper, Carlos set another log on the fire. You'll need rest. Weather might break tomorrow. Aubrey nodded but didn't move toward the bed. Instead, she sat close to the flames, eyes unfocused. I keep seeing him fall, she whispered. The snow turned red. I can't forget it. Carlos looked into the fire with her. I seen blood on snow before. Takes a long time for that color to fade in your head. How do you live with it? He hesitated, then said softly, You don't. You just learn to pray over it till the Lord takes the picture away. Her lips quivered. Do you believe he still listens? I reckon he listens most to the ones who think he don't. For a while, neither spoke. The wind outside died down to a sigh. Somewhere in the forest, a coyote called once, then again, its cry fading across the valley. Carlos lay down on his bedroll, facing the door. Get some sleep, Aubrey. You're safe now. She watched the fire burn low. Thank you, she whispered. He didn't answer, but inside something warm and painful stirred, a feeling he'd buried as deep as the man under the pine. When dawn came again, the ridge shone white under clear sky. The storm had passed. Smoke rose straight from the chimney. Carlos stepped out to check his traps. The cold bit his lungs, but the air smelled clean. Wood smoke, pine, and promise. When he returned, Aubrey had tidied the cabin. The quilt was folded. The dishes were clean. She smiled faintly when he walked in. I thought I'd make myself useful. He smiled back. You already did. That afternoon, while sunlight melted the snow from the window ledge, Carlos fixed a loose hinge on the door. Aubrey read aloud from the Bible, her voice slow but steady. The verse she chose made him pause in his hammering. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Her voice trembled on the words, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Outside, the wilderness lay still and white, the ridge quiet as prayer. Inside the small cabin, two strangers sat by a fire that no longer felt lonely. The mountain had taken many lives, but that night it gave two back. By the next morning, the ridge stood buried under 1.5 feet of new snow. The sky glowed the faint pink of early winter sun, and the air bit sharp enough to sting the lungs. Carlos rose before dawn as he always did, his body already tuned to mountain hours. He fed the fire and stepped outside, breath pluming in the cold, the world silent except for the groan of pines weighed down by ice. Inside, Aubrey stirred in her blanket by the hearth. Her cheeks had color again. When Carlos came in with an armload of wood, she sat up fast, clutching the quilt. I heard the latch move. Just me, he said gently. Ain't nobody else coming up this ridge for a while. Snow's too deep. She nodded, relaxing by inches. Sorry, I keep thinking someone's after me. They were, Carlos said, setting down the wood. But the storm bought you time. Aubrey pulled the blanket tighter, eyes on the fire. The man I shot. He wasn't traveling alone. There were 2 more with him. They said something about a payday. Carlos frowned. Stage robbers? She shook her head. Not robbers. They had papers. They said they were hired guards for a mine company. But the way they talked... She hesitated. It didn't sound right. Carlos didn't press her. He had learned long ago that truth came out slower than smoke through a damp chimney. Eat your breakfast, he said, handing her a plate of fried rabbit and corn mush. You'll feel stronger with something warm inside you. They ate in silence, both listening to the wind at the window. The world outside the cabin was buried deep and wide, tracks covered, secrets hidden. By midday, the wind dropped and the sun burned through, glinting on snow-crusted branches. Carlos stepped out to split kindling. Each swing echoed across the clearing, dull and clean. When he came back in, Aubrey was on her knees by the hearth, scrubbing the plank floor with a wet cloth. You don't have to do that, he said. I want to, she replied. It helps me not think. He understood. Work was a kind of medicine. He'd used it himself after the war, swinging an axe till his arms went numb, trapping until his mind forgot the faces of men he'd lost. By evening, the cabin smelled of soap, stew, and smoke. Aubrey's hair, now brushed and tied back with a strip of linen, shone like chestnut in the firelight. Carlos took a seat by the stove, sharpening his knife. Tomorrow I'll check the traps farther down the ridge, he said. We need more meat. Shouldn't be gone long. Do you think it's safe? Safer than sittin' still. Weather's clearin'. Folks might start movin' again, though. She looked up sharply. Folks? Riders, soldiers, anyone with reason to come this way. She said nothing after that, but her hands shook as she ladled stew into their bowls. The next morning dawned bright and still. Carlos saddled his mare, Belle, an old buckskin with a steady gait, and loaded his traps. Before he left, he gave Aubrey a written note in his plain, careful hand. If I don't come back by dark, light this candle in the window, he said. I'll see it from the ridge. She folded the note carefully. All right? He touched his hat and started down the trail. The day was long and quiet. He reset traps, checked lines, and found tracks of elk near the creek. But he also found something else. Boot prints, half filled with drifted snow. 2 sets. Fresh. Carlos crouched, fingers brushing the edges. They led toward his ridge. He straightened slowly, heart thudding. The army patrol or bounty men? He turned Belle toward home, urging her faster through the trees. The sun was dipping behind the peaks by the time he saw the eye. Cabin roof through the timber. Smoke rose thin and steady from the chimney. A horse snorted. Not his. Carlos slid off Belle and crouched behind a pine, scanning the clearing. 2 bay horses stood tied near the fence. He recognized the saddle style. Military issue. He approached from the side, boots silent in the snow. Inside, men's voices. Heard she came this way, one said. Name's Aubrey Loring, nurse, shot Mr. Bell's boy clean through. Another voice, older, rougher. Orders say bring her back alive, but if she resists... Carlos pushed the door open. Evening, boys. 4 soldiers froze mid-bite, their tin plates of stew still steaming on his table. Aubrey stood by the fire, pale but composed, holding the coffee pot like a weapon. Name's Sergeant Whitlow, the older one said, standing. We're on patrol from Fort Marin, looking for a woman traveling alone. You seen anyone? Carlos met his eyes. Ain't seen a soul but snow for days. Whitlow studied him, then the room. His gaze lingered on the extra plate by the fire. You live alone up here? That's right. Mind if we look around? Carlos shrugged. Ain't much to see. The sergeant's men began peering into corners, lifting blankets, tapping at the floorboards. Aubrey stayed near the hearth, head lowered, her shawl pulled close. One of the soldiers paused by her. You all right, miss? Carlos cut in. She's my cousin's widow. Came up before the storm hit. Took sick. Lost her voice near froze. The sergeant frowned, half believing, half suspicious. Strange place for a lady to winter. Safer than the towns lately, Carlos said evenly. You boys must have heard what happened on the stage line. Whitlow's face tightened. We heard. That woman's wanted for murder. Shot the son of Cyrus Bell, mine owner down valley. There's a bounty now, $500. Carlos's jaw clenched. 500 don't buy justice. Whitlow's hand rested on his revolver. That's not your concern, Trapper. If she comes this way, best you report it. Carlos nodded slowly. I'll do that. The sergeant tipped his hat. Much obliged. When they stepped outside, Carlos followed, pretending to check his mare's tack. The soldiers mounted and rode off down the trail, their voices fading into the trees. He stood there until their hoofbeats were gone, then turned back inside. Aubrey leaned against the wall, trembling. They were looking for me. Yeah, he said quietly. And they'll keep looking. I told you he was a rich man's son. They'll never believe it was self-defense. Carlos poured her a cup of water. Then we'll make sure they don't find you till we got proof otherwise. She looked up. Proof? Something that tells your side's the true one. You said there were others with him. She nodded. 2 men, I don't know their names, but one, called the other Holt. He had a scar across his cheek. Carlos's eyes narrowed. I know a Holt. Used to work the freight line. Might still be around Fair Creek. Aubrey frowned. Would he talk? Maybe, if I ask the right way. He stared into the fire, thinking. Outside, snow whispered off the roof. The next morning, Carlos rose early. The soldiers hadn't returned, but their tracks were still fresh on the trail. He cleaned his rifle and packed a few pelts into a sack. I'll ride into town tomorrow, he said. Trade these, see what folks are saying. Aubrey's brow creased. Isn't that dangerous? Maybe. But sitting here waiting for someone else to decide your story's worse. She reached out, touching his arm lightly. You don't have to risk yourself for me. He met her eyes. Maybe not. But I reckon God sent you here for a reason. I ain't turning you out now. The words hung between them like something fragile and bright. She dropped her gaze, cheeks warming. Then I'll keep the fire till you're back. Carlos smiled faintly. That's a fair trade. That night he barely slept. The face of the dead man flickered behind his eyes. The fine coat, the cruel sneer frozen in snow, and another face, long ago, in a saloon full of shouting men, blood on sawdust, the way guilt clung like smoke. He rose before dawn, saddled Belle, and packed what food he could. The trail would be rough, but Fair Creek lay only 12 miles away if the pass held. As he left, Aubrey stood at the door, shawl wrapped tight. Be careful, she said softly. He tipped his hat. Always am. She watched until he disappeared into the white trees. The journey down the ridge took most of the day. Snow packed thick under Belle's hooves, and the creek crossings ran thin and icy. By late afternoon, Carlos reached the edge of town. Little more than a scatter of wooden buildings and smokestacks under a low gray sky. He rode straight to the livery, stabled his mare, and walked toward the general store. Posters flapped on the post outside. Wanted, Aubrey Loring, murder of Cyrus Bell Jr. Reward, $500 dead or alive. Carlos's jaw tightened. Inside, the storekeeper, A stout man with tobacco-stained fingers looked up. "Well, if it ain't red, thought you'd froze up there." "Close enough," Carlos said. "Need flour, salt, and lamp oil?" The man weighed the order, then lowered his voice. "You hear about that nurse? The one shot Bell's boy?" Carlos feigned ignorance. "Heard a whisper. Bell's sendin' men everywhere. They say she's got Apache sympathizers hidin' her." Carlos's eyes narrowed. "Why's that?" "Turns out young Bell was keepin' a half-breed child up at the ranch. Folks say the woman was protectin' the girl when she shot him." Carlos felt his pulse quicken. "You mean Bell's got a daughter?" "Illegitimate. Half Apache. He's hidin' her. Now, they say." The man shrugged. "Rich folks' troubles, I reckon." Carlos finished paying, thanked him, and stepped outside. Across the street he saw Preacher Harlan sweeping the steps of his small church. The old man looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Carlos Red, thought the mountain had eaten you whole." "Not yet," Carlos said, shaking his hand. They spoke quietly inside the parsonage, where a pot of coffee steamed on the stove. Carlos told him enough, about the woman, the storm, the soldiers. Not her name, but the truth beneath it. Harlan sighed. "Cyrus Bell's sin runs deep. That boy he raised, mean as a snake. The girl's mother was Apache. He paid the army to keep that quiet." "You think anyone else knows?" "Maybe the nanny. She's still at the ranch, they say. She's the only one the child trusts." Carlos rubbed his chin. "If I could get the girl's word, maybe the army'd listen." Harlan shook his head. "You'd have to be careful. Bell's men watch everyone who gets near that ranch." Carlos looked towards the window, where snow began to fall again in thin, slanting lines. "Careful's all I got left." He left town at dusk, the wind rising behind him. The lamps of Fair Creek disappeared fast in the snow. Somewhere far above, a candle waited in a cabin window. He pressed Bell onward through the dark. By the time he reached the ridge, the sky had cleared and the moon hung low over the valley. The cabin light flickered steady. When he stepped inside, Aubrey ran to meet him. "You're back," she breathed. He smiled faintly. "Told you I would be?" "What did you find?" He set down his pack, face grave. "Enough to know the man you killed had more blood on his hands than yours ever will." She blinked. "What do you mean?" "Bell's son was hiding his father's shame. A little girl, half Apache. You saved her, Aubrey. That's the truth of it." Her lips parted in disbelief, then trembled with quiet relief. "Then maybe God hasn't forgotten me after all." Carlos met her gaze, steady and kind. "Reckon he just needed the snow to slow you down long enough to be found." Outside, the ridge lay still under the moonlight. The world felt a little cleaner. But down in the valley, trouble was still stirring. And soon, it would come climbing up the mountain again. Morning came pale and quiet, the kind of cold that made every sound sharp as glass. The storm had settled into calm, leaving a world blanketed and hushed. Carlos stood by the door, fastening his coat and pulling on his gloves. Aubrey was stirring a pot of coffee on the stove, her face half-shadowed by the firelight. "You think they'll come again?" she asked softly. Carlos glanced toward the snow-laden ridge. "Maybe not right away. They'll wait for tracks to melt and tempers to cool. But they'll come again, sure enough." Aubrey poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed him one. Her hand brushed his glove for a second. Small, accidental, but enough to remind them both they weren't strangers anymore. "What will we do when they do?" she asked. He took a sip, eyes fixed on the small window fogged with frost. "We'll be ready. You'll stay hid, and we'll make a plan that lasts longer than a single storm." Aubrey nodded slowly. "A plan?" Carlos set the cup down, his breath a faint cloud in the cold air. "You can't keep running. You'll freeze or hang. I'll help you make it through the winter, and come thaw, we'll find a way to clear your name." She hesitated. "You'd risk that? For me?" He shrugged, as if to make light of it, though his eyes softened. "I ain't got much else to risk, and I reckon a man's got to stand for something before he dies." For a moment, silence settled between them, broken only by the hiss of coffee on the stove. Aubrey folded her hands together, eyes glinting with something between gratitude and disbelief. "Then, I'll stay. I'll help however I can." Carlos nodded once. "Good. Then it's settled." He took a small piece of charcoal and scratched words on a scrap of paper, laying out what they needed to survive till spring. Meat, salt, wood, water, traps, repairs. It wasn't much, but it was a plan. They worked side by side the rest of the day. Carlos showed her how to twist kindling from dry bark and stack it in neat cords by the hearth. Aubrey mended torn mittens with deer sinew and patched a rip in his coat. He set traps near the tree line and came back with a hare and a squirrel, enough for stew. By late afternoon, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and broth, the air warmer, more alive. For the first time since she'd come through the door half dead, Aubrey hummed softly while she worked, an old tune she couldn't quite remember all the words to. Carlos didn't interrupt. The sound was gentle and human, and it filled the empty places he'd lived with for years. When evening came, he brought in 2 buckets of snow to melt for water. Aubrey added more wood to the fire and handed him a bowl of stew. "You live up here all alone?" she asked. He nodded. 3 winters now. Easier than living in a town that don't forgive." Her brow furrowed. "What did you do?" Carlos stirred his stew slowly. "Once, a man insulted someone I loved. I let my anger speak louder than my sense. Shot him in a card house. Wasn't self-defense. So I came here, where nobody asks questions." Aubrey watched him quietly, seeing not the hardened trapper the world might, but a man carved hollow by regret. "And do you think God forgave you?" she asked. He stared into the fire. "I hope so, but I ain't asked him lately." Her voice was soft, almost reverent. "Maybe he sent me to remind you how." He gave a quiet, weary smile. "Maybe he sent you to see if I still could." The next morning the air broke cold and sharp. Carlos rose early to haul more wood, the axe ringing steady through the clear air. Aubrey swept the cabin floor, wiped the shelves, and straightened what little they owned. There was comfort in order, even in this lonely place. When he came back in, she said, "I'd like to earn my keep. I can cook, mend, keep the place clean." "You don't owe me work," he said. "I know," she replied gently, "but I need to feel useful again. I need to stop thinking about what happened." Carlos studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, we'll do this together." He showed her where to hang herbs from the rafters to dry, how to tell good firewood from rot, how to listen for the faint groan in the wind that meant a storm was rising. She learned fast, asking questions, remembering small details. He admired her grit, the same grit that must have kept her alive through that long night in the snow. When dusk fell, they sat by the fire, reading from the Bible he'd pulled from the shelf the night before. His voice stumbled on certain words, slow and uncertain. Aubrey took the book and read aloud instead, her tone clear and calm. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." The words filled the small room, wrapping around them like a blanket. Carlos bowed his head, whispering, "Amen," though his voice cracked on the word. When she closed the book, he said softly, "You read it like you believe it." "I want to," she said. even if I don't know how anymore." "You'll find your way back," he told her. "The Lord don't lose folks easy." The days slid one into another. Snow came, then melted a little, then froze again. Aubrey grew stronger, her color returning, her hands steady. Carlos taught her how to snare rabbits, how to track prints through the trees. She cooked bread over the fire and stitched a new quilt from scraps of cloth he'd saved from trade. They learned to speak without many words. A look was enough. A nod. The passing of a cup, or the small comfort of shared silence. But even peace, when it comes, is never left alone for long. One afternoon, while Carlos was splitting logs behind the cabin, Belle snorted and tossed her head. Carlos straightened, sensing it too, the faint thud of hooves far down the valley. He stepped to the edge of the trees, listening. The sound faded, but the unease stayed. That night, when the fire had burned low, Aubrey looked up from her sewing. "You're worried," she said. He nodded slowly. "Tracks down valley. Horses, not deer. Might be scouts from the fort or bounty riders. I can't tell yet." Her hands went still. "You think they'll find us?" "Not if the weather holds, but it means we've got to be ready." "Ready how?" He looked toward the door. "If I say hide, you go to the root cellar. Don't argue, don't ask. Just go." She hesitated, then nodded. "All right." He met her eyes. "I ain't letting them take you." Sec the quorum. Room fell silent, except for the soft pop of the fire. Aubrey swallowed hard. "Why?" she asked quietly. "You don't even know me." Carlos turned back to the flames. "Maybe I don't need to. I know what it's like to be hunted for one mistake. I ain't letting that happen to you." A tear slid down her cheek, but she wiped it away quick. "Then I'll do what you say." "Good," he said, rising to check the shutters. "We'll keep the fire low and the door barred after dark. No smoke by daylight." As he moved around the small room, she watched him. Steady, quiet, purposeful. A man who'd spent years building walls around himself, now breaking them down one act of kindness at a time. A few days later, the storm clouds lifted. The snow crusted hard enough to walk on without sinking. They worked outside, mending the fence and clearing drifts from the roof. Aubrey's cheeks flushed pink in the cold. "You ever miss town?" she asked. Carlos shook his head. "Town's got too many people talking and not enough listening." "I used to think noise meant safety," she said. "Now I think silence does." He smiled faintly. "You're learning the mountain's language." She smiled back. "Maybe it's learning mine." When they went inside that evening, she lit the lamp and filled the cabin with a warm, golden glow. The light touched his face, and she saw it clearly then, the lines of sorrow softening, replaced by something steadier. He took a seat across from her. "You ever think about what you'll do when it's over? When spring comes?" Aubrey hesitated. "I don't know. I used to want to open a small clinic, somewhere quiet, help people. But now..." She looked down at her hands. "Now I just want to live without fear." Carlos nodded. "Then that's what we'll aim for. A life without fear." Outside, the moon rose silver over the snowfield. The cabin glowed like a lantern in the wilderness. For the first time in years, Carlos didn't feel alone. And though neither spoke it aloud, both knew what was happening between them. The slow thawing of two hearts frozen too long. But far below, in the valley where greed and vengeance never slept, a telegram was being sent to the fort, stamped with the seal of Cyrus Bell. The hunt wasn't over. It was only waiting for better weather. The snow had crusted hard enough to carry a man's weight. The ridge shone silver under a pale sun, the air sharp with the scent of pine and smoke. Carlos Red moved through the clearing, with his axe balanced over one shoulder, his breath rising like steam. Behind him, Aubrey hung a line of damp clothes, her fingers red from cold water. They had settled into something that felt almost like a rhythm, the steady pace of two people building a small world against a great one. Inside the cabin, coffee simmered on the stove, its smell mingling with pine pitch and clean wool. Carlos came in and hung his coat. "We'll have another snow tonight," he said. "Wind's turning east." Aubrey looked up from folding a shirt. "You can tell by the air?" He nodded. "Air tastes different when it's carrying snow. You'll learn." "I reckon I will." He smiled faintly at her use of his word. It had been 3 weeks since the cavalry patrol, and the mountain had gone quiet again. But quiet on a mountain was never peace. It was a kind of holding breath. They ate supper early, stew and rough bread. Afterward, Carlos drew a map in the dust on the table. "If I don't make it back one day, you follow the creek west till you find the mission. Reverend Samuel Ridge runs it. Half Cherokee. Good man. Tell him I sent you." Aubrey frowned. "Don't say that. You're not leaving." "Storms, bullets, bad luck. Sometimes a man don't get a choice. You should know where to go if something happens." She nodded slowly, tracing the line he drew. "You trust him?" "With my soul," Carlos said. "He's the one who taught me what forgiveness means, or tried to." Aubrey looked up, her eyes softening. "Then I'll remember the name." That night, the storm came as Carlos predicted, fast and hard. Wind shook the shutters, rattled the stovepipe, and sent snow hissing through every seam in the logs. They sealed the door with a wool blanket and kept the fire steady. Aubrey sat by the hearth mending socks, while Carlos whittled a piece of cedar, his knife moving slow and sure. He was shaping a small cross, smoothing it with the back of his thumb. "Who taught you to carve?" she asked. "My father," he said. "He was a cooper before the war. Said a man's hands should always know how to make something besides harm." Aubrey smiled faintly. "That's good advice." "Didn't follow it much when I was young." Her thread paused mid-stitch. "War?" He nodded. "Cavalry. Missouri Volunteers. Saw more death than I ever wanted to. Came back angry, meaner than when I left. Thought I was fighting for right, but most of what I did just left holes in men and in me." Aubrey lowered her sewing. "And the man you killed later, the one in town?" Carlos's knife stopped. The wind howled through the chimney. "He said something about my brother. I drew before thinking. Been running from that shot ever since." For a long time, the only sound was the fire. Then Aubrey said softly, "You stopped running when you opened that door for me." Carlos met her eyes. The stormlight flickered in them, warm, steady, alive. "Maybe," he said. He set the finished cross on the table between them. "For you," he said, "so you remember this place, even if you have to leave it." Aubrey touched it gently, her fingers tracing the grain. "It's beautiful. Cedar don't rot easy. It lasts." She looked up at him, voice trembling. "Do you think God still listens to people like us?" Carlos nodded slowly. "He listens most to the ones who think he don't." Tears glistened in her lashes. She turned back to the fire, whispering, "Then maybe he'll forgive me for surviving?" He said nothing more, but reached across the table and laid his hand over hers. Her fingers stayed still beneath his, not pulling away. The fire popped, sparks leaping into the chimney, and for the first time in months, she felt warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. When morning came, the world lay buried again. Carlos rose early and opened the door to find snow piled knee-deep. The storm had swept the ridge clean of tracks, except for one set of hoofprints near the far fence, half filled and frozen. He crouched to study them. They weren't his. Someone had ridden close during the night, He went back inside, quiet but tense. Aubrey was stirring porridge. "More snow?" she asked. "Yeah," he said slowly. "And maybe something else." Her face paled. "Tracks?" He nodded. "Could be hunters. Could be worse." "What will you do?" "See where they lead." Aubrey grabbed his arm. "Don't go, not alone." He shook his head. "I've lived with this ridge longer than they have. I'll be fine." She let go, but her eyes filled with worry. "Promise you'll come back." Carlos met her gaze and gave a small nod. "I promise." He took his rifle and slipped out, moving through the trees where snow muffled every sound. The tracks led downslope, winding toward the frozen creek. He followed for half a mile before they split. 2 horses. He crouched again, frowning. One had turned back, the other pressed on towards the lower valley. He followed until the tracks vanished at the creek bed, washed smooth by thawing ice. Whoever it was had come close, seen the cabin, and gone. Watching. By the time he returned, dusk was falling. Aubrey met him at the door, her relief plain as sunlight. "You're back," she whispered. "Always," he said. He stamped the snow from his boots. "They're riding south again. Might be bounty men, might just be lost. But we'll need to be careful from here on." Aubrey nodded. "What do we do?" He looked around the cabin, the wood stacked high, the fire steady, her mended clothes hanging neat by the wall. It wasn't much, but it was home. "We wait. Keep living. Let the storm hide us." That night they read again from the Bible, her voice soft but strong. When she finished, she looked up and said, "I used to pray for someone to come find me after that night on the road. I thought maybe no one ever would." Carlos's throat tightened. "Sometimes God answers by sending folks who need saving just as bad as you do." She smiled faintly through her tears. "Then he sent you." He turned his gaze to the fire, heart thudding. "Maybe he sent you to remind me what mercy looks like." Days passed. The rhythm of work and rest steadied them. Carlos hunted, trapped, and chopped wood. Aubrey cooked, read, and sewed. They laughed once in a while, though quietly, as if afraid the mountain might hear. When the weather broke again, Carlos rode down to the lower meadow to check snares. The snow reflected sunlight so bright it hurt his eyes. He thought of the promise he'd made, to help her clear her name. But how? The mine baron's reach stretched from the fort to the judge's bench. Still, there had to be truth buried somewhere beneath all that gold and fear. By the time he rode back, twilight painted the snow lavender and blue. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the sight of it filled him with something close to peace. Inside, Aubrey had laid supper ready. She smiled as he entered. "You look cold enough to break." He laughed softly, hanging up his coat. "That's mountain air for you. Keeps a man humble." They ate in companionable silence. Afterward, Carlos said, "When spring comes, we'll go down together. There's a preacher in Fair Creek who still believes in law with a conscience. Maybe he'll help us find the truth about that man you shot." Aubrey's fingers trembled slightly on her cup. "You think anyone will believe me?" "I do," he said simply. "And that's enough to start." Her eyes filled, and she nodded, unable to speak. Late that night, while Carlos banked the fire, Aubrey lay awake listening to the wind. For the first time since the attack on the stage road, she wasn't afraid of the dark. The snow outside no longer looked like a shroud, but like a promise. Clean, quiet, and new. She turned her head toward where Carlos slept on his bedroll by the door, his broad frame outlined by the dim orange glow of embers. He had promised to keep her safe, and somehow she believed him. Outside, the moon broke through the clouds, silvering the trees, and the mountain seemed to breathe again, alive, patient, watching. The ridge had seen many winters, but this one carried something different in its stillness, the fragile, flickering light of redemption beginning to take root. The days grew shorter, and the snow piled higher, pressing the mountain into silence. The ridge seemed frozen in time, just the steady sigh of the wind and the faint creak of the pines under their icy weight. Carlos had known many winters alone, but never one that carried warmth, never one that felt shared. Each morning, he rose before dawn to tend his trap lines. The frost stung his cheeks as he walked, his boots crunching through the crusted snow. He checked his snares, collected what the mountain gave, and thanked the Lord quietly for each small mercy. When he returned, smoke was already curling from the chimney, and inside the cabin, the air smelled of stew or bread or coffee, depending on the day. Aubrey had made the space her own, clean, orderly, and humming with life. "Found 3 rabbits and a fox," Carlos said, stomping snow from his boots one morning. Aubrey looked up from kneading dough, smiling faintly. "You always bring back more than you say you will." He shrugged. "The mountain provides when you treat her fair." "She seems to favor you," Aubrey said. Carlos gave a small laugh. "She's tried to kill me plenty too. Guess we're even." They fell into a rhythm: work, prayer, silence, small talk. Each night they read from the same Bible passage, Aubrey's voice soft, Carlos's steady beside her. They didn't need many words. The quiet between them was comfort, not distance. By mid-January, the sky cleared for a few days. The snow sparkled so bright it hurt the eyes. Carlos mended the roof, and Aubrey hung laundry outside, her cheeks pink from the cold. She had grown stronger, her shoulders squared, her steps more sure. When she caught Carlos watching her one morning, she smiled shyly. "I look like a person again, don't I?" He grinned. "Reckon you always did." The warmth that passed between them hung in the air for a moment, fragile as frost on glass. Then she turned back to her washing, pretending to be busy, and he went back to chopping wood, hiding a smile. That afternoon, they sat together as sunlight faded through the small window. Aubrey sewed new lining into his coat, her fingers quick and sure. Carlos carved another small shape from cedar, something he didn't name yet. "You were a nurse before all this?" he asked. She nodded. "At the mining camp outside Fair Creek, I treated everyone. Miners, soldiers, Apache children sometimes. Illness doesn't care who you are." Carlos nodded. "My ma used to say that too. Folks bleed the same color no matter the side they're on." Aubrey's hands slowed on the cloth. "You fought in the war. You must have seen so much of that." "Too much," he said simply. "And yet you still helped me." He met her gaze. "Maybe helping you is the Lord's way of giving me a second chance." Aubrey lowered her eyes, whispering, "Then maybe he sent you for both of us." That night, the wind howled again, but the storm passed them by. They kept the fire low and talked quietly about small things, the smell of apple pie, the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings, the way snow softened everything ugly. "Do you miss people?" Aubrey asked suddenly. Carlos tilted his head, thinking. "Sometimes. Then I remember most folks talk too loud and don't listen enough." She smiled. "You're not wrong." "But I do miss the sound of laughter," he admitted. "It's been a while since this cabin heard any." Aubrey hesitated, then let out a small laugh. Soft at first, then growing until it filled the cabin. Carlos chuckled with her, shaking his head. "There now. Cabin remembers." When the laughter faded, quiet settled again, but it was a peaceful quiet. Not loneliness, Just rest. Before sleeping, Carlos checked the door latch, then lay down on his bedroll by the door. He kept the rifle close, but for the first time in years, he slept without dreams. February came bitter and long. The sky stayed gray for days on end, and the snow rose higher against the cabin walls. Water froze in the bucket each night, and Carlos had to break ice in the creek every morning. The days blurred together, measured only by the chores and the slow ticking of the wooden clock on the shelf. Still, there was comfort in the sameness. Aubrey made a list of supplies to stretch: beans, cornmeal, salt pork, dried apples. She rationed carefully, keeping them fed. Carlos admired how she managed it all with calm steadiness. One morning, she found him mending a snare and said, "You'd make a good doctor, you know. You've got patience in your hands." He chuckled. "Patience is just what's left after you lose everything else." She looked at him for a long time. "Do you ever wish you could go back?" "To when?" "To before the war, before you had to hide up here." Carlos's eyes darkened. "No use looking backward? Past don't change, no matter how hard you stare at it." "But faith can," she said quietly. "Maybe that's why you're still alive." He glanced at her, half smiling. "You sound like a preacher's daughter." "Just a sinner trying to sound like one." He laughed softly. "You're doing fine." The thaw began slowly. Icicles dripped from the eaves. The air smelled faintly of mud and pine sap. The first blackbirds appeared on the branches. Carlos watched them from the porch, hat tipped low, rifle resting across his knees. "Looks like spring's thinking about us," he said. Aubrey came to the doorway, her hands clasped around a tin cup. "You think we'll make it?" "We already have," he said. "Just need the world to catch up." She stepped beside him, the wind tugging her hair loose from its braid. "It feels strange," she said, "to want to live again." Carlos turned to her, his voice quiet. "That's how you know you're getting healed." For a long while they stood there, the sound of dripping water marking time. Then, faintly, from far below the ridge, came the echo of hooves. Carlos stiffened. "Get inside." Aubrey obeyed, without question. Carlos scanned the slope below, spotting a small column of riders moving through the trees. Too far to make out uniforms, but the glint of rifles was unmistakable. He ducked inside. "They're back." Her face went pale. "The soldiers? Maybe bounty men. Maybe worse. Either way, they ain't riding for church." "What do we do?" He loaded his rifle, checked the window latch. "Keep the lamps low. No fire after dusk. If they come close, you go to the cellar. Don't make a sound till I come for you." Aubrey's voice shook. "And you?" "I'll be right here." She swallowed hard but nodded. That night, they sat in darkness, the only light from a sliver of moon through the window. Outside, faint voices carried on the wind, then faded. The riders passed without stopping, their tracks half covered by fresh snow by morning. Carlos exhaled slowly. "They didn't find us." Aubrey let out a trembling breath. "Thank God." He nodded. "He's watching over us, sure enough." Aubrey touched the cedar cross that hung now around her neck. "I think maybe he is." Carlos smiled, weary but grateful. "Keep that faith, Aubrey. It'll take you farther than fear ever will." Outside, dawn crept up pale and gold across the snowfields. The danger wasn't gone, but for now the ridge was quiet again. And in that stillness, something new had taken root. Not just survival, but hope. By the time the first thaw came, the mountain dripped with meltwater. Snow slid from branches with soft thuds, and the creeks ran black with ice melt. The world was waking up again. But peace on the ridge was a thin blanket, easily torn. Carlos stood at the edge of the clearing, studying the valley below. A gray haze hung over Fair Creek, thin lines of smoke rising from chimneys, the faint clang of a distant hammer carried by wind. He hadn't been down there in over a year, not since the fight, not since the world had branded him a ghost best forgotten. Inside the cabin, Aubrey folded a blanket into a pack. "You're sure about going?" she asked, worry creasing her brow. Carlos nodded. "If I can learn what Bell's men are saying, maybe we can plan our next move. I'll trade for supplies, too. Salt, flour, maybe news from the fort." She hesitated, clutching the strap of the pack. "What if someone recognizes you?" He smiled faintly. "I'm just another trapper to them. Nobody cares much about a man who lives on the wrong side of the snow." "But if they find out about me—" "They won't," he said firmly. "You'll stay hid till I get back. If anything happens, remember what I told you. Head west along the creek till you reach Reverend Ridge's mission." She nodded, swallowing her fear. "Promise me you'll come back." Carlos met her eyes and spoke softly. "I've kept every promise so far." He left at dawn the next morning, Bell's hooves crunching through the half-frozen crust. The sky glowed pale gold between the ridges. He rode light, carrying only a bundle of furs for trade, a knife, and his rifle across his saddle. The trail was slow, winding through narrow cuts where the snow still lingered in the shadows. Once he spotted a fox darting between spruce trunks, its red tail flashing bright against the white. Another time, he passed the charred remains of a wagon. Snow piled through its broken spokes like bones. By late afternoon, the valley opened before him. Fair Creek spread out along the river. Rough wooden buildings, a sawmill, and a single church steeple catching the last light. Carlos rode into town quietly, hat low, boots slick with melted snow. The air smelled of smoke, whiskey, and coal. He tied Bell behind the livery and stepped onto the muddy street. Inside the general store, the stove crackled and men talked in low tones. Posters hung near the door. Aubrey Loring, wanted for murder, reward $500. Carlos kept his face calm, his heart steady. The shopkeeper, a round man with sharp eyes, nodded in greeting. "Well, if it ain't the trapper from Black Timber Ridge, been a while," Carlos grunted. "Had a long winter." "Didn't we all?" the man said, scooping beans into a sack. "You hear about the nurse? Bell's boy's killer?" Carlos kept his tone even. "Heard some talk. Word is, the old man's gone near mad over it. Sent riders as far as Pueblo. Says the woman's got Apache ties. Folks say she hid with Indians once. You believe that?" Carlos shrugged. "Don't know what to believe anymore." "Fair enough. Half the valley's gone sour since that business. The army's sniffing around, and the mine's paying men to dig up dirt instead of ore." Carlos took his supplies, paid in furs, and stepped outside. Across the street he saw the preacher's whitewashed church. A lantern flickered in the window. Without thinking, he crossed the muddy street and knocked on the door. "Come in," a familiar voice said. Reverend Harlan looked older, his beard grayer, but his eyes were kind as ever. Carlos read, "Thought the mountain swallowed you." "Almost did," Carlos said with a small smile. "Got something you should hear." He closed the door behind him and lowered his voice. "There's a woman up my way. Says she shot a man in self-defense. That man was Bell's boy." The preacher's expression sobered. "I've heard whispers. They say she was trying to protect someone." Carlos leaned forward. "The girl. Bell's daughter. Half Apache. That true?" Harlan sighed. "Aye, the child's been kept hidden since her mother died. Folks know, but they don't say it aloud. Bell feared what the town would do if they saw his shame." Carlos frowned. "Where's the girl now?" "With her nanny at the Bell Ranch. The old man don't let her out. Says he's protecting her, but it's his pride he's guarding, not her safety. I need her word, Carlos said. If she saw what happened, if she can tell the truth, maybe it'll save that woman's life. Harlan rubbed his beard. Dangerous business, friend. Bell's men don't forgive, and they don't forget. I ain't asking for forgiveness, Carlos said quietly. Just truth. The preacher studied him for a long moment, then nodded. You always were stubborn for righteousness. All right. I'll send word through a friend who works the ranch kitchen. If the girl's willing, we'll find a way. Carlos nodded his thanks. Don't send word to the fort. They're in Bell's pocket. Understood. The preacher poured coffee into 2 chipped cups. They drank in silence a moment before Harlan said softly, You've changed, Carlos. Used to be you carried anger like a badge. Carlos looked down. Ain't got room for it no more. The woman I'm helping, she's been through enough hate to last a lifetime. Then maybe this is your penance, Harlan said. Maybe it's my salvation. That night, Carlos slept in the livery loft, wrapped in his blanket. He dreamed of fire and snow, of a woman's voice crying, I'm not clean anymore. He woke before dawn, the dream still clinging like frost. By sunrise, he was back on the trail. Halfway up the ridge, he saw smoke rising from the timberline. Too much for his small cabin. His pulse quickened. He urged Bell forward, heart pounding with each turn. When he reached the clearing, his worst fear clawed at him. The door hung open. Snow drifted across the threshold. A saddle lay half-buried near the woodpile, but the cabin stood silent. Aubrey? He called, voice breaking the stillness. No answer. He leapt from the saddle, rifle in hand, and pushed through the doorway. The room was empty, but the fire still burned low, the stew pot warm, 2 cups set on the table. Then, faintly, from beneath the floor, came a muffled knock. Carlos dropped to his knees, lifted the trap door, and exhaled in relief. Aubrey. She scrambled up from the root cellar, pale and shaking. They came, she gasped. 2 riders. Said they were scouts from the fort. I hid when I heard them. He grabbed her shoulders gently. Did they see you? I don't think so. They searched the shed and left. They said something about a man riding into town today. Carlos's grip tightened slightly. Then they were tracking me. Her eyes widened. Did they follow you back? Don't think so, but we'll have to be ready in case. He checked his rifle, then knelt beside her. You did right, hiding like I told you. I was scared, she whispered. So was I, he admitted. But we're still here. Her voice shook. What did you find out? He told her about Fair Creek, the preacher, the girl, the truth behind Bell's secret. As he spoke, tears welled in her eyes. So it was for the child, she whispered. He was hurting her. Carlos nodded grimly. And you stopped him. That's what I aim to prove. She touched the cedar cross at her throat. Then maybe this fight's worth living through. He met her gaze, voice low and sure. It is. Outside, snow began falling again. Soft, steady, covering the old tracks. The mountain, as always, erased the past 1 flake at a time. But this time they meant to leave a mark that wouldn't fade. The next morning dawned calm and still. A thin frost coated the pine needles, and the creek below the cabin murmured faintly beneath its shell of ice. Carlos stood by the door fastening his coat, his movements slow but deliberate. The tension of the past days hadn't left his shoulders. Aubrey poured water from the kettle, her face pale but steady. Where will you go today? She asked. I ain't going far, Carlos said. Need to check the traps and see if those riders left fresh tracks down valley. Won't take long. Do you think they'll come back? He paused, looking through the frost-laced window toward the ridge. They might, but we can't live jumping at every sound. Fear's a worse jail than any fort. Aubrey nodded, her fingers clutching the cedar cross that hung from her neck. "Then we'll keep living." "That's the spirit," he said softly. Before leaving, he pointed to the loaded pistol on the table. "You know how to use it?" "I've used one before," she said quietly, her eyes darkening. "Then only if you have to. And don't wait to run if it comes to that. You head west, you hear?" "I will." He touched the brim of his hat, then stepped out into the white morning. The ridge felt different now, less lonely, more watchful. Carlos moved through the trees like a man who knew every sound and shadow. He found the trapline undisturbed except for one snare snapped clean, the snow scuffed by boot heels. Someone had come close. Too close. He crouched and examined the tracks. 2 men again, heavy boots, 1 horse tethered near the creek. They had searched the area but not gone farther uphill. He followed the prints until they crossed the stream and vanished into the timber. "Cowards," he muttered, then turned back toward home. The sun had dipped low by the time he reached the clearing. Smoke rose steady from the chimney, Aubrey keeping the fire alive. But another plume of smoke drifted farther off, near the lower ridge. Carlos froze, heart hammering. That wasn't her doing. He hurried inside. "Pack what you can," he said quickly. "We've got company down below." Aubrey's eyes widened. "How close?" "Close enough I can smell their cook fire." "What'll we do?" "Hide, same as before. But this time we'll be ready to move if it comes to it." He gathered his rifle, ammo, and a satchel of food. She packed blankets, herbs, and the Bible. As she worked, her hands trembled, but her face stayed calm. "Where would we go?" she asked. "West to the mission. Ridge'll take us in. He's good people." She hesitated, then nodded. "Then I trust you." That trust, Carlos thought, was a heavier thing than any rifle. Night fell thick and fast. They kept the lamps dim, the fire buried under ash to hide its glow. Outside, the snow reflected the moonlight, turning the woods silver and blue. Then came the sound, hooves crunching slowly, cautiously, on frozen ground. Voices murmured, muffled by the trees. Carlos motioned to Aubrey. "Cellar," he whispered. She obeyed silently, lifting the trap door and lowering herself into the darkness. Carlos closed it gently and pulled a rug over the seam. He moved to the window, rifle ready. 2 riders emerged from the tree line, their breath white plumes in the cold. He recognized one by the scar on his cheek. "Holt." "Lord above," Carlos whispered. "It's him!" Holt swung down from his horse, lantern in hand. "Cabin looks lived in," he said to his partner. "If she's here, the bounty's ours by dawn." Carlos took aim, but didn't shoot. 2 men he could handle, but not if there were more waiting in the trees. The men walked closer. Holt cupped his hands and shouted, "Anybody home?" Carlos stepped into the doorway. "Evening," he called. Holt froze, squinting. "Who the hell are you?" "Name's Red. This is my ridge." "Any woman here?" Holt demanded. Carlos leaned casually against the frame. "Ain't seen one since summer. What's your business?" "None of yours," the other man sneered. "We're hunting a killer." Carlos's voice dropped an octave. "Then you best make sure you ain't hunting angels by mistake." Holt's eyes narrowed. "Watch your tongue, trapper. I know your kind, hiding thieves and runaways." Carlos smiled faintly. "You talk awful bold for a man who don't know whose ground he's standing on." The other man shifted uneasily. "Come on, Holt. We'll check the next ridge." But Holt hesitated, glaring. "If she's here, we'll find her. Nobody hides from the Bell name." Carlos didn't answer. He just watched until the men rode off, their silhouettes swallowed by the trees. He stayed by the door for a long time, rifle ready, listening to their hoofbeats fade. Only when the night was silent again did he lift the trapdoor. Aubrey climbed up, eyes wide. Was it them? He nodded. The one you called Holt. He's alive and he's hunting you. She swallowed hard. Then they'll come back. Maybe. But we'll be gone before they do. He threw a few more logs on the fire, the flames casting gold across his face. Get some rest while you can. We ride at first light. Aubrey sat by the fire, hugging her knees. I don't know how to thank you. Carlos shook his head. Don't. Just live. They left before dawn. The world was a blue shadow, the snow crunching under Belle's hooves as they moved west. Aubrey rode behind Carlos, her arms tight around his waist, the cedar cross pressed against her chest. By mid-morning, the trail dipped toward the lowlands. They passed through frozen meadows where elk tracks crisscrossed the snow, and the wind smelled faintly of thawing earth. Once we reach the mission, we'll be safe, Carlos said. Ridge don't turn away souls in need. Aubrey nodded, though fear still shadowed her eyes. And what about you? The law could call you a wanted man for helping me. He smiled faintly. Law don't mean much if it ain't just. They rode in silence after that. By late afternoon, they stopped near a frozen pond to rest Belle. Carlos spread a blanket, and they shared jerky and a little bread. The sunlight glinted off the ice like glass, and for a moment the world seemed still again. Aubrey looked at him, her voice soft. Do you ever wish for a home that isn't borrowed from the mountain? He thought for a long moment before answering. I used to think I wasn't meant for one, but now... He looked at her, smiling slightly. Now I ain't so sure. She blushed, lowering her gaze. You've given me mine. He reached out, brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. Then maybe that's enough. The peace between them was quiet and deep, but peace never lasted long on the frontier. A rifle cracked from the trees. Carlos lunged, knocking Aubrey to the ground. A bullet tore through the blanket where she'd been sitting. Stay down, he shouted, returning fire toward the flash of smoke. The echo rolled across the valley. Birds exploded from the trees. Riders! Carlos yelled, spotting 3 silhouettes on the ridge, Holt and 2 others. He fired again, forcing them back behind the rocks. Get to the horse! Aubrey scrambled toward Belle as another shot rang out. Carlos fired twice more, the recoil biting into his shoulder. The riders retreated, disappearing into the timber, but Carlos knew they'd be back. He grabbed the reins and swung up. Hold tight! They rode hard through the pines, snow spraying behind them, the horse's breath coming in white clouds. The wind howled past, the world a blur of gray and white. When they finally stopped, it was near dusk. They'd put miles between them and the ridge. Carlos helped Aubrey down, his chest heaving. You hurt? He asked. She shook her head. No. You? Not yet. He smiled grimly. They missed. God must still have plans for us. She looked around the quiet clearing. Where are we? Half a day from Ridge's mission? Then we're close. Close, Carlos said, but not safe. He looked back the way they'd come, his eyes narrowing. Holt wasn't the kind to give up easy. And somewhere beyond the trees, the next storm was building, one that would decide whether mercy could survive the frontier's wrath. The snow started again that night, soft flakes drifting down like ashes, erasing the trail they'd left behind. Carlos built a small fire under the shelter of a pine ridge, the flame barely bright enough to warm their hands. Aubrey sat across from him, her blanket pulled tight, eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. They won't stop, she whispered. You know that, don't you? Carlos stirred the fire with a stick. They'll stop when they can't find us, and when they do, we'll be with people who will stand for truth. She watched him, her voice small. You believe that? I have to, he said simply. It's all a man's got. He handed her the last of the dried meat and poured melted snow into a tin cup. They ate in silence, the fire snapping softly between them. Beyond the glow, the forest waited, still listening. Aubrey broke the quiet first. I keep seeing his face. The man I killed. Every time I close my eyes, he's falling again. Carlos met her gaze across the firelight. You see him because you're human, but you're not guilty. You did what you had to do. Her voice cracked. Then why do I still feel dirty? Carlos looked at the cross around her neck. Because mercy don't come all at once. It's like spring. It melts you slow. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she didn't hide it. You talk like a preacher. He smiled faintly. Just a sinner with a memory. They slept little that night. Carlos woke often, hand on his rifle, ears straining for the creak of saddle leather or the jingle of spurs. But the woods stayed silent except for the whisper of snow. At dawn, he stamped out the fire and saddled Belle. The mare's breath hung white in the cold air. We've got a day's ride to the mission, he said. Maybe less if the trail holds. Aubrey climbed up behind him, arms around his waist. I'm ready. They rode through the morning, following the narrow creek that wound down from the ridge. The world around them sparkled. Snow-covered spruce, the sharp scent of cedar and wet earth. For the first time in days, Carlos allowed himself to breathe easier. Then, near midday, the echo of distant hooves broke the stillness. Carlos reined in. The sound came from behind, faint, steady, relentless. Aubrey tensed. Them? Could be, he said. Hold tight. He kicked Belle into motion. The mare surged forward, hooves pounding over the frozen ground. The forest blurred past, branches whipping their coats. Behind them, the hoofbeats grew louder. Gunfire cracked through the air. A bullet tore bark from a tree inches from Carlos's shoulder. They found us! Aubrey cried. Carlos urged the mare faster. The creek curved ahead, its ice glinting like glass. Hold on! They burst onto the frozen surface, the horses' hooves clattering. Halfway across, the ice groaned. A spiderweb of cracks spread under the mare's weight. Carlos turned her sharply toward the far bank. The ice held. Barely. They reached the opposite side and plunged into the trees just as another shot rang out. For a while, the chase vanished behind them. When they stopped, both were shaking with cold and adrenaline. Carlos dismounted and checked Belle's flank. No blood, just sweat steaming off her hide. She's fine, he said, though his voice trembled. Aubrey slid down, her hands shaking. You could have been killed. So could you. She looked at him, eyes wide with a mix of anger and fear. Why are you doing this for me? You don't even know me. Carlos stepped closer, voice rough. Because I know what it's like to live with ghosts, and I ain't letting you carry this one alone. For a heartbeat, they stood there, snow falling between them like dust in sunlight. Then she reached for his hand and gripped it tight. Then we'll face it together, she said. He nodded. Together. By late afternoon, the land began to dip toward a wide valley. In the distance, they saw smoke rising, not from pursuers this time, but from chimneys. That's it, Carlos said softly. Ridge's mission. Aubrey's breath caught. It's real, he smiled. Told you so. They rode the last mile slow. The mission sat on a small hill built from pine logs and stone. A bell tower rose above it, the cross at its peak glinting faintly through the snow. Beside it stood a barn, a well, and a handful of small cabins. When they reached the yard, a tall man stepped from the doorway. His dark hair was streaked with gray, and his face carried the calm of someone who'd seen much and judged little. Carlos read, he said, smiling. Didn't think I'd see you again this side of heaven. Samuel Ridge, Carlos said, grinning despite himself. You're still keeping watch up here. Till the Lord says otherwise, Ridge replied. His gaze softened when he saw Aubrey. You've brought someone in need. This is Aubrey Loring, Carlos said quietly. She's been through more than most should. Needs rest and maybe a bit of mercy. Ridge nodded. Both come free here. He ushered them inside, where warmth and the smell of baking bread met them. A woman with kind eyes, Eliza Ridge, hurried forward, taking Aubrey's hands. Come sit by the fire, child. You look half frozen. Aubrey tried to speak, but her throat closed up. She let Eliza lead her to a bench near the hearth. Carlos stood near the door, hat in hand. We owe you more than I can pay. Ridge shook his head. Mercy ain't a debt, brother. Sit, warm yourself. That night, the storm finally broke. The mission's windows glowed gold in the darkness. Inside, Carlos sat by the fire with Ridge, while Eliza tended to Aubrey's bruised hands. Ridge poured coffee and leaned forward. Tell me what brings you here. Carlos told him everything. The ambush, the outlaw's death, the bounty, the chase. Ridge listened without interrupting, his dark eyes steady. When Carlos finished, Ridge nodded slowly. Bell's Reach has poisoned half the valley. His son's cruelty was no secret. But the truth... He sighed. Truth dies quiet when fear pays better. Carlos clenched his fists. I need proof. Something that clears her name once and for all. Ridge stood, moving to a shelf. He pulled down a leather-bound ledger. I might have what you need. Bell's men bring supplies through here sometimes. I keep record of every name and every mark. He flipped through the pages, tapping one entry. Here, Cyrus Bell Jr., traveling with guards Holt and Baines. Their route matches the stage line your lady was on. And here, payment received for clearing liabilities. That's a fine way of saying hush money. Carlos's jaw tightened. That'll do. Ridge handed him the ledger. Take it to the magistrate in town when the thaw comes. He's not an honest man, but he's afraid of paper with ink on it. Aubrey looked up from the hearth, her eyes glimmering in the firelight. You think they'll listen? Ridge smiled gently. They'll have to. Truth, written plain, don't melt like snow. Eliza came over then, setting a bowl of broth in Aubrey's hands. Eat, dear. You've walked through enough shadow. Time to sit in the light a while. Aubrey's lips trembled. I don't know how to thank you. Live clean and love brave, Eliza said softly. That's thanks enough. Later, when the others had gone to rest, Carlos lingered by the fire. Aubrey sat beside him, her eyes heavy but peaceful. You think we're safe now? She asked. He looked at her for a long time before answering. Safe? Maybe for tonight. But tomorrow's always got its own kind of danger. She nodded, smiling faintly. Then I'll take tonight. He reached into his pocket and handed her something small. The cedar carving he'd been working on since before the storm. A tiny sparrow, wings spread. For courage, he said quietly. Aubrey turned it over in her hands, tears glistening in her eyes. You've given me more than courage, Carlos. You've given me hope. He met her gaze. Hope's stronger when it's shared. Outside, the bell tolled once in the night wind, low, solemn, full of promise. And for the first time since that bloody snowstorm on the ridge, Aubrey Loring slept without fear. Morning broke soft over the mission. Frost glistened on the chapel roof, and smoke drifted from the kitchen chimney, curling gentle against a sky pale as milk. Inside, warmth wrapped the small wooden rooms. Carlos sat by the hearth, shoulder-bandaged, his eyes following the flicker of firelight across the floorboards. Aubrey moved quietly near the window, folding linens Eliza had washed. The storm outside had passed, but inside, another kind of reckoning stirred. Samuel Ridge entered, wiping his hands on a rag. "You both slept near 12 hours, he said, smiling faintly. "The Lord knew you needed rest." Aubrey offered a small smile. "Feels like the first real sleep in months." Carlos nodded. "I'd forgotten what quiet sounded like." Ridge poured coffee for them, his voice steady. "Quiet's the Lord's way of letting a man hear his own heart again." The preacher sat across from Carlos, studying him kindly. "You've carried something heavy, my friend. It's written in your eyes. Want to lay it down before God and man?" Carlos hesitated, gaze falling to the floor. "Ain't easy to say." "Truth rarely is," Ridge said softly, "but it frees whoever speaks it." Aubrey looked from one man to the other, sensing what was coming. Carlos drew a slow breath. "Years back, after the war, I killed a man in anger, shot him in a saloon. He wasn't armed. Been running ever since. Told myself I came, up here to start over, but I was just hiding from my own shame." Aubrey's eyes glistened. "You weren't alone in running," she said quietly. Ridge's expression didn't change, only grew gentler. "You confessed. That's the first step. The Lord already knows, Carlos. He's just been waiting for you to remember he forgave you long ago." Carlos swallowed hard. "Don't seem right. Forgiveness coming that easy." Ridge smiled faintly. "Grace never was fair. That's why it works." Silence fell again, peaceful and full. Aubrey reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly as she laid it over Carlos's. "You helped me carry my shame. Now let me help you set down yours." He looked at her, at the quiet courage in her eyes, and felt something inside him unclench for the first time in years. The bell outside rang once, breaking the stillness. Eliza's voice called from the next room. "Samuel, you'd best come see this. A rider from town, urgent." Moments later, a young courier stepped inside, hat in hand, breath white in the cold. "Message from Fair Creek, Reverend. Brought it straight from the parsonage." Ridge opened the folded note, reading quickly. His brow lifted. "The child. Belle's daughter. She's at the ranch still, but frightened. The nanny's ready to speak. They're willing to testify if we can get them safe." Carlos straightened. "Then we go." Aubrey froze. "Now? After what we've been through?" He turned to her, calm but resolute. "You said yourself, we can't run forever. That girl's truth can clear you." Ridge nodded. "The Lord didn't bring you here just to hide. He brought you to finish what mercy started." Aubrey's voice trembled. "What if they kill us before we get there?" Carlos met her gaze, firm and gentle all at once. "Then we die doing right." The room went still. Outside, the mission bell tolled again, low and steady, echoing through the valley. Aubrey stood slowly, lifting the cedar cross from her neck and pressing it to her lips. "Then we ride at first light," she whispered. Carlos's hand closed around hers. "Together," he said. The wind stirred the curtains, carrying the scent of snowmelt and wood smoke, the smell of change. And somewhere beyond the ridge, justice began to thaw with the morning sun. The dawn came cold and silver, the air so still it seemed to hold its breath. A thin layer of frost glazed the mission yard. Carlos saddled Belle while Reverend Ridge checked his old rifle. Aubrey stood nearby, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. Eliza stepped out carrying a small satchel. "For the road," she said, handing it to Aubrey. Inside were bread, dried apples, and 2 clean bandages. "You bring that girl back safe, and you make sure you come back too." Aubrey smiled faintly. We'll try. Ridge gave Eliza's hand a squeeze. Keep the bell ringing. If we don't return by sundown. Carlos cinched Belle's saddle tight. You sure you're coming, Reverend? It's bound to be rough. Ridge smiled, a calm light in his eyes. A shepherd don't send his flock into danger without walking beside them. Carlos nodded once. Then we ride together. They left the mission just as the first sunlight touched the snowfields. Their breath hung white behind them as they rode down the valley trail. The world smelled of thawing pine and promise. Aubrey rode behind Carlos again, holding on as the horse moved through the cold air. Every turn of the trail brought back memories. Fear, running, firelight. But this time, she didn't look away from the past. She faced it. Ridge led them west, following a narrow trail that wound between firs and rocky ledges. We'll reach the ranch by midday if we keep pace, he called back. The valley widened, revealing the Bell estate in the distance, a grand house of whitewashed logs and a barn set against the slope. Smoke rose from the chimney. Beyond it, the mine shaft gaped black and silent. Aubrey's voice trembled. I never thought I'd see this place again. Carlos glanced back at her. You can turn back if you need to. She shook her head. Not this time. When they reached the edge of the ranch, they dismounted and tied the horses behind a stand of willows. Ridge motioned for quiet. The kitchen door's on the east side. That's where the nanny should be. They crept through the snow, keeping low. The yard was empty except for 2 horses hitched near the barn. Carlos scanned the windows. No movement, just the flutter of curtains. Ridge knocked softly on the kitchen door. A woman opened it, a middle-aged lady with weary eyes and dark hair streaked with gray. The girl, Marisol, clung to her skirts. Reverend, the woman whispered. Thank heaven. We've been waiting. Carlos stepped forward, tipping his hat. We'll get you both to safety. The woman nodded, eyes darting toward the barn. 2 guards left at dawn, but one's still here. He'll sound the alarm if he sees us. Then we best be quick, Ridge said. They hurried toward the horses, keeping to the shadows. The girl held Aubrey's hand tight. I remember you, Marisol whispered. You saved me. Aubrey smiled softly. No, sweetheart, you saved me. But just as they reached the fence, a shout split the air. Hey, stop right there! A man burst from the barn, rifle raised. Carlos spun, firing once. The shot struck the ground near the man's boots, sending him stumbling back. Go! Carlos shouted. Ride hard! Ridge lifted Marisol onto his horse. Aubrey climbed up behind Carlos. The girl cried out as the guard fired again, but the bullet whined harmlessly past. Belle lunged forward, hooves pounding through the snow. They rode until the ranch was a blur behind them, the shouts fading into wind. Only when the mission bell faintly echoed in the distance did they slow. Ridge turned in his saddle, his voice carrying over the cold air. The Lord was with us. Carlos glanced back at Aubrey and the child, both clinging tight. He's still riding with us yet. And as the sun climbed higher over the valley, the 3 riders pressed on, toward truth, toward justice, and the mercy waiting beyond the mountain's shadow. The ride back to the mission felt endless. The horses' hooves beat a steady rhythm through the snow, their breath rising like steam in the cold morning air. Behind them, the Bell Ranch shrank to a smudge of smoke against the horizon. Carlos rode at the rear, rifle slung across his chest, eyes scanning the ridge for riders. When they finally reached the mission hill, Eliza stood waiting by the door, her hands pressed together. The bell rang once, slow, grateful, alive. Praise be, she whispered as they rode in. Reverend Ridge dismounted first, lifting Marisol gently from the saddle. The little girl clung to him, her eyes wide and frightened. Aubrey slid down next, steadying the child's nanny. "You're safe now," she said softly. Eliza hurried them all inside. The warmth hit like sunlight after a long storm. The women were seated near the fire while Carlos barred the door and checked his rifle one last time. "They'll notice she's gone," he said. "We've bought time, but not much." Ridge nodded. "Then we use it wisely." He knelt in front of Marisol, his voice gentle. "Child, do you remember what happened at the ranch? What the man did before you ran?" The girl hesitated, twisting a piece of her shawl in her fingers. "He shouted at me. He hurt my nanny when she tried to stop him. The lady with the red scarf." She looked toward Aubrey. "She pulled me away and told me to run." Aubrey knelt beside her, voice shaking but steady. "You did brave that day. What you saw can help people understand the truth." Marisol looked up, eyes glistening. "If I tell, will the bad men come back?" Ridge shook his head. "No, little one. The truth puts bad men to rest." The child nodded solemnly, leaning against Aubrey's shoulder. Carlos leaned back against the wall, exhaustion washing through him. For the first time in weeks, something like peace settled over him. The truth had a voice now, and it was small but strong. Eliza brought bowls of broth and set them on the table. "You all need strength for what comes next," she said. "The road to justice is rougher than any mountain trail." Aubrey sipped the broth slowly, her eyes far away. "I never thought I'd see this day," she murmured. "I thought the truth would die with him." Carlos sat across from her, speaking quietly. "Truth don't die easy. It just hides till brave folks bring it back." Ridge rose, rolling up his sleeves. "I'll send a rider to the parsonage in Fair Creek tonight. The magistrate will listen when I deliver him. Proof. And a child's sworn word." Aubrey touched his arm. "Will they believe her?" "They'll have to," Ridge said. "Bell's power ended when his son raised his hand against innocence." Marisol looked between them all, voice soft. "Will we go to town tomorrow?" Carlos nodded. "At first light. We'll ride together. You'll be safe between me and the Reverend." The girl managed a small smile. "Then I ain't afraid." Eliza laid a blanket around her shoulders. "You keep that faith, sweetheart. It'll carry you farther than any horse." Outside, dusk fell over the valley, blue and still. The wind whistled through the trees, but inside the mission, firelight glowed on faces lined with exhaustion and hope. Aubrey glanced at Carlos across the fire. He met her gaze, and in the quiet that passed between them was every promise they hadn't yet spoken aloud. They were no longer running. They were standing, for truth, for each other, and for the chance to live clean before God and man. And as the bell tolled softly in the night wind, the mountains seemed to echo back, "Let the truth be known." Dawn broke clear and cold, the sky streaked with pale gold. Frost glimmered on the mission's railings, and the horses stamped their hooves in the yard. Carlos tightened Bell's girth, while Reverend Ridge packed the ledger and sworn notes into a satchel. Aubrey stood nearby, adjusting Marisol's shawl. The girl's small hand clutched her cedar cross as if it were armor. Eliza hugged each of them before they mounted. "The Lord goes with you," she said, her voice thick. "Ride steady and keep your eyes open." "We'll be back by sundown," Ridge promised. "And if not, ring the bell till heaven hears." The trail down from the mission was slick with half-melted snow. Every hoofbeat echoed like a heartbeat. They rode slow at first, the world around them hushed, except for the whisper of the wind. Carlos led, his eyes scanning every ridge. Aubrey rode behind him with Marisol wrapped warm in her arms. Fair Creek came into view by mid-morning, the town quiet under a thin veil of mist. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the clang of a hammer rang faintly from the blacksmith's shed. As they approached the main street, townsfolk looked up, some curious, some wary. Ridge guided them straight to the courthouse, a 2-story wooden building beside the church. The magistrate, Mr. Hensley, met them on the steps, flanked by 2 soldiers from the fort. His face was long and lined, his eyes cautious. "Reverend Ridge," he said, "you've brought company." "I've brought the truth," Ridge replied evenly, handing him the satchel, "and a child with the courage to speak it." Inside, the courtroom was cold, the stove unlit. Hensley unfolded the ledger and scanned the pages, his brows knitting. "These are Bell's records," he muttered. "You realize what this means?" Ridge nodded. "It means the woman you hunt was never the killer, only the shield between evil and a child." Hensley looked at Marisol, who stood trembling beside Aubrey. "You're saying this girl saw it herself?" Marisol swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. He hurt my nanny and tried to hurt me." The lady stopped him. Her voice was small but clear. The silence that followed felt sacred. Even the soldiers shifted uneasily. Hensley sighed, setting the papers down. Bell's name carried weight in this territory, but dead or not, truth still matters. He reached for his quill. "I'll send word to the fort and to Denver. The warrant's lifted, effective today." Aubrey's breath caught. "So it's over?" The magistrate nodded slowly. "You're free, Miss Loring. The law owes you an apology." Carlos closed his eyes, the tension draining from him like water off stone. Ridge bowed his head in silent thanks. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds, warming the wooden steps. When they stepped back into the street, townsfolk gathered, whispering. Some looked ashamed, others curious. Preacher Harlan came from the church door, his old eyes bright with tears. "I told them justice still lived in this town," he said, clasping Ridge's hand. Ridge smiled. "It lives when good men keep it breathing." Carlos turned to Aubrey. "You're free now. No more hiding." She looked up at him, her eyes full of quiet wonder. "Free," she repeated softly, as if testing the word for the first time. Marisol tugged her sleeve. "Does that mean we can go home now?" Aubrey knelt, smiling through tears. "Yes, sweetheart. We can finally go home." Carlos stood behind them, hat in hand, watching the snowmelt trickle down the gutters. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. A clean heart, a clear sky, and the sound of freedom ringing like a bell. And as the wind lifted through the empty street, it carried the promise that mercy had won. When they rode back toward the ridge, the sky was wide and gold with spring. Snowmelt trickled down the slopes, carrying pine needles and new life. The air no longer smelled of fear. It smelled of thawed earth and hope. Aubrey rode beside Carlos now, not behind him. Her hands were steady on the reins, her back straight. "Feels strange," she said softly. "The world looks the same, but everything inside me's different." Carlos smiled, the kind that started small and grew slow. "That's what freedom feels like. Ain't loud, just quiet and honest." Marisol rode ahead with Reverend Ridge, laughing for the first time since the storm. Her voice carried on the wind like a hymn. When they reached the cabin, Aubrey dismounted and looked around. The roof still held patches of snow, the hearthstone was cold, but it felt like home. "We made it back," she whispered. Carlos nodded. "And this time we ain't hidin'." She turned to him, eyes bright with tears. "What'll you do now?" He met her gaze. "Build, stay, maybe start again, with someone who knows how to forgive." Aubrey smiled through her tears. Then we'll start together. And as sunlight broke over the ridge, two souls once lost to guilt stood in the warmth of grace, free, forgiven, and finally home. Spring deepened on the ridge. The pines glistened with sap, the air smelled of rain, and the sound of the creek ran steady again. The cabin that had once been a refuge of fear now stood open to sunlight. Carlos replaced the broken shutters, while Aubrey tended to a small garden by the porch. Marisol played nearby, chasing butterflies that danced over the thawed grass. Reverend Ridge visited once a week, bringing letters from town. One afternoon he handed Carlos an envelope, stamped with the seal of the court. Inside was a single paper declaring Aubrey Loring officially cleared of all charges. Carlos read it aloud by lamplight, his voice quiet with awe. Aubrey listened, tears running freely, then whispered, "It's real," he smiled. Always was. They sat together as dusk deepened, hands entwined. The fire crackled softly. "You think we deserve all this peace?" she asked. Carlos looked toward the window where the stars were beginning to show. "No one earns peace, Aubrey. We just learn to keep it when it's given." Outside, the bell from the distant mission tolled faintly across the valley. Marisol curled up on a quilt near the hearth, drifting to sleep. Carlos wrapped an arm around Aubrey's shoulders. "We've both come through the storm," he said. "Now let's build something worth the saving." And as the night settled over the mountains, their world, once marked by guilt and snow, was filled instead with warmth, forgiveness, and a new beginning that would last beyond winter. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.